In Theorizing Sociology, the authors introduce a sociological theory known as essentialism. The idea that queer people are, quote, born this way stems from this theory. It states that sociology plays no role in identity, that our current social categories and the identities and behaviors associated with them all come from biology. This theory would say that sex determines gender and that gender determines sexuality. There's also a belief that one's gender presentation should reflect the innate sexuality that one is born with. This causes folks to think that they can tell someone's sexuality based upon how they present themselves. This causes many problems for queer people, the main one being that in order for sexuality to be biological, then so must gender. This invalidates people who do not identify with certain gender categories, as well as people whose gender and or sexuality vary from day to day or through their lives. If gender were biological and sexuality were biological, they would remain static throughout everyone's lives. During Week 7, in Unusual Fingers, Scientific Studies of Sexual Orientation, Linda Burke talks about how culture shapes science. It shapes the questions we ask, how we try to answer those questions, and how we interpret the results. We only try to explain deviant forms, in this case of sexuality. We never try to scientifically or otherwise explain straightness, because straightness is seen as natural. Therefore, it's only talked about that we cure or eliminate homosexuality. In order to discuss this, we first have to talk about what is sexuality, then. Theorists have come to the conclusion that sexuality is an amalgamation of desires, behaviors, and pleasures. Sexuality is far too complex to be caused by a single gene, because everyone experiences sexuality differently. Due to their differing identities people hold that intersect with their sexuality. No two people experience sexuality the same way, thus, a gene is not a good explanation for sexuality.
The Born This Way movement drastically changed the perception of what Rubin titles the charm circle. The charm circle is a way of categorizing sexual behaviors as normal or abnormal with criteria that would label it as such. By stating that sexual orientation and gender identity is innately biological, it moves the two from the unnatural category into the inner circle as natural or biological. The movement has brought upon the idea of sexual essentialism, that behaviors, identities, and desires come from biology, which is beneficial to making the topic easier to understand for those who do not identify with the community, but can also lead to severe consequences. This has been shown in the past through the eugenics movement, which sought murderous solutions for genetic imperfections. It can also assimilate the queer community to the heterosexual one. Jackson and Scott would also see this as a change in the sexual hierarchical system and would shift perceptions of what sexuality is better than the other, or more natural, so to speak. On the other hand, this shift in theory around identity would also enforce the culture around parties and sexual exploration. As Rupp analyzes the party environment of young folks, one sees an arena of sexual exploration because of alcohol in a male-dominated space. Female-identifying individuals see an opportunity to seek sexual activity with other females through the guise of male pleasure. Ward notes that heterosexual males are more apt to adopt a hypermasculine attitude in this type of space, where lesbian sexual activity reinforces their heterosexuality and gives women an opportunity to engage in same-sex sex without stigma. Threesomes give way to homosexual experiences, but because of the sexual double standard, this allows what happens in a hookup environment to be normal. That the behavior one is engaging in does not dictate an identity, but biologically satisfying. Male sexual behaviors make lesbianism a more natural occurrence for male pleasure as a biological response to normative sex.
According to Katz, prior to the establishment of capitalism as the economic structure, queer identities did not exist because there was no societal structure that allowed survival if one were to not be heterosexual or cisgender, especially for women. In the agricultural society we existed in prior to capitalism, women were unable to own property or money and had very little autonomy as a result. Without money or property, women are unable to support themselves and therefore would no other choice than to be heterosexual and get married to a man who would then support her.
The way that the Born This Way movement dictates the way queer folks speak about their oppression is linked to power. The way that we speak about being queer tends to emphasize how painful it is to be queer and how it is not a choice to be queer because it is so painful that nobody would choose it. The Born This Way movement has used this narrative to emphasize their demand for rights by using the argument that it is inhumane to deny rights based on an identity that you cannot choose for yourself. However, this negative discourse surrounding queerness also impacts the queer population because it implies that being queer is an inherently negative thing. Harwood, 2004, describes this way of speaking about queer sexuality as a wounded truth. The wounded truth belief that being gay brings pain is utilized by both anti- and pro-gay arguments. Previously, we spoke about the way that the Born This Way movement utilizes wounded truths to advocate for their rights. Anti-gay organizations, on the other hand, push the wounded truth narrative to dissuade people from exploring their sexuality. The way we weave language around subjects involves power, as discussed previously, and speaking about queer sexuality from a wounded truth narrative allows the creation of an underclass of the sexually deviant that dominant groups are allowed to exert institutional power against in order to suppress. Before the 18th century, there was a lot more sexual freedom, and people were much more open to seeing sex as a pleasurable activity. According to Michel Foucault, since the 18th century, we have created an atmosphere where only sexual behavior that is reproductive is acceptable. Foucault also asserts that language and knowledge are closely linked to power. Whoever determines what can be talked about also determines what can be known, and whoever determines what can be known determines how we think and who we are.